Police body cam footage captured a young Army wife's anguished cries as she cradled her dying husband on New Year's Eve, blood pooling on the driveway beneath them. 11 days later, investigators discovered she'd orchestrated his execution with a lover she'd been messaging on Snapchat, convinced the evidence would simply disappear. St. Joseph Township sits on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, the kind of small town where people still leave their doors unlocked and know their neighbors by name. December 31st, 2018, arrived cold and clear. Families were gathering for New Year's parties, champagne was chilling, and countdown clocks were being checked. For 23-year-old Army Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III, it should have been a simple holiday visit home. He'd made the drive from Fort Stewart, Georgia, with his wife Kemia and their nearly 2-year-old son, planning to ring in the new year with family before returning to base. The house on Colfax Avenue was filled with the comfortable chaos of relatives laughing, sharing food, and swapping stories. Outside, the temperature hovered just above freezing. By midnight, one family would be celebrating, another would be shattered. Tyrone Hassel III, everyone called him Ty, had the kind of smile that photographs couldn't quite capture. His father, Tyrone Jr., would later describe how his son could walk into a room and change its energy completely, not through volume or bravado, but through genuine warmth. Ty had that quality some people have of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the world. He'd enlisted in the Army while still in college, motivated by a simple truth he'd shared with his father. He'd grown up in Benton Harbor, Michigan, and he knew there wasn't much opportunity there. The military offered a path forward, a chance to build something. At Fort Carson in Colorado, he'd met Kemia. Their relationship moved quickly. His father learned about the engagement almost as soon as Ty did. They married in 2016, and when their son was born, Ty seemed to settle into fatherhood with the same steady dedication he brought to everything else. By late 2018, both Ty and Kemia were stationed at Fort Stewart in Georgia, both serving as active duty soldiers in the 3rd Infantry Division. On the surface, they looked like the ideal military couple. Young, ambitious, building a life together. Their social media showed smiling photos, family moments, the kind of images that suggest happiness. The New Year's Eve party was at a relative's house on Lincoln Street, just a short drive from where Ty's father lived on Colfax Avenue. Kemia had stayed back at the Colfax house with their son. She'd told Ty she was tired, that she'd rather let the baby sleep than drag him to a crowded party. Around 11 that night, Ty left the celebration. He'd fixed a plate of food for Kemia, loaded it carefully into a container, and headed back. It was the kind of small gesture that defined him, thoughtful, considerate, thinking of his wife even while he was out having a good time. He pulled his pickup truck into the driveway on Colfax Avenue at 11:04 p.m. The porch light was on. The street was quiet. Most people were still at parties or gathered inside their homes, waiting for midnight. Ty grabbed the food container and walked toward the house. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be captured only in fragments. The sound of footsteps behind the shed. The figure emerging from the shadows. 4 gunshots that shattered the cold night air. Ty dropped the food container. He managed to turn to see his attacker before the next shots found him, 2 bullets to the head, 1 to the neck, 1 to the shoulder. He collapsed between his truck and the house, blood spreading dark across the frozen ground. Inside, Kemia heard the shots. Her 911 call came in at 11:04 p.m. The dispatcher could barely understand her through her screams. She was outside now, in the driveway, cradling Ty's head in her lap. When the first police officers arrived 3 minutes later, their body cameras recorded a scene of pure devastation. A young woman in complete hysteria, her husband's blood soaking into her clothes, her voice raw with panic and grief. Officer Jeremy Peppers would never forget trying to load Ty onto the ambulance gurney Kemia was trying to climb in with him, reaching for him, her face twisted in anguish. The responding officers had seen grief before, but this felt overwhelming, all-consuming. One of them would later say he'd never seen someone so shattered. Ty was pronounced dead at Lakeland Hospital 20 minutes later. 4 gunshots, close range. The medical examiner would determine he'd survived the first shots long enough to understand what was happening to him. On New Year's Eve, while families counted down to midnight a few miles away, Tyrone Hassel III died in an ambulance, 23 years old, leaving behind a widow, a toddler son, and a father who'd just lost his best friend. Detective Sergeant Dan Lanier of the St. Joseph Township Police had been a cop for 19 years, but this case hit differently. A soldier, home on leave, murdered in his father's driveway on New Year's Eve. The brutality was shocking. 4 close-range shots suggested this wasn't random. This was execution. The crime scene told its own story. A K-9 unit tracked a scent from Ty's truck behind 2 sheds, across Delaware Avenue, onto Gerald Street, where the trail went cold near Hunter Avenue. Someone had been waiting. Someone who knew the property layout, who'd positioned themselves perfectly to ambush Ty when he returned from the party. The food container he'd been carrying lay spilled on the ground, a devastating detail that would haunt everyone who saw the scene. Detective Lanier and his team began with the obvious questions. Who would want Ty dead? The answer, initially, seemed to be nobody. Interviews with family and friends painted a consistent picture. Ty didn't have enemies. He wasn't involved in anything shady. He was a soldier, a father, a son. He helped people. He smiled at everyone. This made no sense. Kemia cooperated fully with the investigation, speaking with police multiple times. She explained that Ty had life insurance through the Army, about $400,000 that she'd receive as his widow. She repeatedly said she had no idea who would target her husband. She seemed genuinely devastated, barely able to function. Ty's father let her and the baby stay in his house for almost 2 weeks after the murder. She was family. She was grieving. They took care of their own. But Detective Lanier had learned over 2 decades to watch for patterns. And something about Kemia's story wasn't sitting right. Nothing obvious. Nothing he could point to in those first few days. Just small inconsistencies in her timeline, the way certain details shifted slightly between interviews. He kept investigating. A neighbor reported seeing a man get into a black car shortly after the shooting. It wasn't much, but it was something. The car had headed north on Gerald Street, disappearing into the night. License plate readers throughout the area were checked. Traffic cameras were reviewed. The investigation was methodical, professional, but it was also going nowhere. Then, 11 days after Ty's murder, everything changed. An anonymous call came into the police department. A woman's voice, careful, measured. She said her son was in the military. She said her son knew Kemia Hassel. And she said Kemia had been having a relationship with another soldier. She didn't elaborate much, but she hinted that this relationship might have led to something terrible. The tip was vague enough that it could have been dismissed as speculation or gossip. But Detective Lanier had been waiting for something, anything, to crack this case open. He made a call to the Army Criminal Investigation Command at Fort Stewart. If Kemia was having an affair with another soldier at their base, someone there would know. The investigators at Fort Stewart started quietly asking questions. And within 48 hours, they had a name. Jeremy Cuellar, 24 years old, also stationed at Fort Stewart in the same unit as Kemia and Ty. Several soldiers confirmed what they'd observed during the deployment to Camp Casey in South Korea. Kemia and Cuellar had been involved. It wasn't exactly secret, though they'd tried to be discreet. But in the close quarters of military deployment, people notice things. When investigators pulled Cuellar's travel records, they found something stunning. He'd made multiple trips from Georgia to Michigan in the days leading up to New Year's Eve. 4 trips between December 19th and December 31st each time. He'd driven his black Chevrolet Impala with Georgia plates north to the Chicago area, then over to Michigan. A license plate reader on M139, a highway near St. Joseph Township, had logged Cuellar's Impala at 8:16 p.m. on December 31st, less than 3 hours before Ty was murdered. The investigation shifted into high gear. On January 11th, 2019, both Kemia Hassel and Jeremy Cuellar were arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. The young widow who'd been staying in Ty's father's house, still crying at family gatherings, was led away in handcuffs. The soldier who'd pulled the trigger was picked up at Fort Stewart. For Ty's father, the arrest was almost impossible to process. The woman he'd taken in, the mother of his grandson, had orchestrated his son's execution. She'd slept under his roof while planning how to spend the life insurance money. She'd held the baby while discussing murder with her lover. The betrayal was bottomless. The case that prosecutors built against Kemia Hassel and Jeremy Cuellar would rest on digital forensics, a tool that has revolutionized criminal investigations in the 21st century. And it would showcase exactly why criminals who think they understand technology usually don't. Kemia and Cuellar had planned the murder primarily through Snapchat. For those unfamiliar, Snapchat is a messaging platform where photos and messages supposedly disappear after being viewed. The appeal for people planning crimes is obvious. Send a message, it gets read, it vanishes. No evidence trail. No prosecutors waving printed texts in front of juries. But here's what Kemia and Cuellar didn't understand. Snapchat messages do disappear from the app itself, but they don't necessarily disappear from Snapchat servers. And with proper legal warrants and skilled forensic analysts, those messages can be recovered. Not always, not every single one, but enough, more than enough. The digital forensics team working with prosecutors began the painstaking process of reconstructing the conspiracy. What they found was chilling in its premeditation and stunning in its documentation. Starting in February of 2018, nearly a year before the murder, Kemia and Cuellar had begun their affair during deployment in South Korea. The messages showed the relationship developing from flirtation to something more intense, then to something darker. By summer, they were discussing Ty as a problem to be solved. Kemia told Cuellar she was deeply unhappy in her marriage, but divorce wasn't an option. If she divorced Ty, she'd lose access to his life insurance. The $400,000, she told Cuellar, would give them a fresh start. They could be together without hiding. They could build the life they wanted. Cuellar, for his part, seemed to oscillate between enthusiasm and hesitation. At one point, he told another soldier he was doing what he had to do. He described the insurance money as a plus, but the recovered messages also showed moments where he seemed to be trying to back out, where the reality of what they were planning became too heavy. The messages revealed the murder had been attempted multiple times before it finally succeeded. Cuellar drove from Georgia to Michigan 4 times in December. Each trip, he and Kemia planned for him to kill Ty. Each time, something went wrong, or Cuellar couldn't go through with it. In one message, Cuellar told Kemia he could handle this. In another, days later, he said he'd choked. The pressure Kemia applied was relentless. The messages showed her pushing, manipulating, insisting. On December 31st, on their 4th attempt, the plan finally worked. Kemia knew Ty was at the party on Lincoln Street. She knew approximately when he'd come back. When she'd asked him to bring her food, she'd given Cuellar the timeline he needed. While Ty loaded a plate for his wife, Cuellar positioned himself behind the shed. waiting in the freezing darkness. The phone records showed Kemia and Cuellar in contact throughout that evening. After the shooting, as Kemia held Ty's dying body and screamed for help, Cuellar was driving north on Gerald Street in his black Impala, exactly as the witness had described. He drove through the night back toward Georgia, believing he and Kemia had pulled it off. The interviews with other soldiers at Fort Stewart filled in more details. One witness said Cuellar had seemed agitated in the days before New Year's. He talked about having to handle something. He'd asked about silencers for handguns. He'd researched how Snapchat's data retention policies worked, trying to understand if deleted messages were truly gone forever. When confronted with the evidence, Cuellar eventually provided a statement to investigators. He confirmed the affair. He confirmed the planning. He described, in painful detail, the attempts that had failed before the one that succeeded. He said it took him at least 6 tries to actually pull the trigger. He portrayed himself as manipulated by Kemia, twisted by what he thought was love, believing he needed to kill Ty to have a future with her. Kemia's statement told a different story. She admitted to the relationship with Cuellar, but claimed she'd been trying to end it. She suggested Cuellar was obsessed with her and had acted on his own. The problem with this version was the digital evidence. The Snapchat messages, once recovered, showed clearly who had been pushing for murder and who had been hesitating. The prosecution had more than enough. Premeditation, conspiracy, digital evidence, witness testimony, and eventually a confession from one of the defendants. Both Kemia and Cuellar were held without bond. The trial was scheduled, and Ty's family prepared to hear, in excruciating detail, exactly how he'd been betrayed. Jeremy Cuellar accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 65 to 90 years in prison. He asked to speak with Ty's father before sentencing. In a 56-minute jailhouse conversation that was later made public, Cuellar apologized repeatedly. He told Ty's father he was truly sorry, that those words meant nothing, but he had to say them anyway. Ty's father told him he appreciated the remorse. The conversation was devastating to watch. Kemia Hassel went to trial. In July 2019, a jury convicted her of first-degree premeditated murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On August 29th, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion as the verdict was read. In court, Ty's mother asked her a question that echoed through the courtroom. How could you? How could you take the life of a man who gave you his last name? Kemia offered no answer. She was led away in chains, and Ty's family was left to raise his son without him. Tyrone Hassel III was buried with full military honors. His 2-year-old son, who'll grow up knowing his father only through photographs and stories, carries his name, Tyrone IV. Ty's parents have vowed to make sure the boy knows who his father was, not how he died, but who he was. The soldier who smiled at everyone, the son who fixed plates of food for people he loved, the young man who joined the army because he wanted to build something better. The case became a teaching tool for digital forensics investigators. The Snapchat recovery, the pattern of deleted messages that could still be rebuilt, the way criminals consistently underestimate how much evidence they leave behind Ty's murder, helped advance techniques that have since been used in dozens of other cases. So here's my question for you. When someone betrays you completely, when the person who vowed to honor you orchestrates your murder instead, does the why even matter anymore? What could Kemia have possibly told herself to justify what she did? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and this case brings up a lot of questions about trust and how well we ever really know anyone. If you want more cases like this, where we dig into both the story and the investigation, subscribe. New episodes drop 3 times a week. This has been Umbra Cases.